Imagine standing in America at the dawn of the 20th century, when horses still clogged the streets and cars were rare curiosities for the wealthy few. Then suddenly the Ford Model T of 1908 burst onto the scene and flipped the world on its head. This wasn't just another machine. It was the first car that seemed to whisper directly to the working class, promising freedom of movement, independence, and a new kind of American life that didn't depend on railroads or city trolleys. Before the Model T, automobiles had been symbols of exclusivity, expensive to buy and complicated to run. Afterward, they became everyday tools, as ordinary as a hammer or a plow. With this shift, Henry Ford didn't just give people a car. He gave them time, space, and opportunity, reshaping how families lived, how towns grew, and how industries evolved. Yet the Model T also carried paradoxes. Its affordability depended on a harshly efficient assembly line that dehumanized workers even as it empowered consumers. And its runaway success locked America into a car-centered future with consequences we still live with today. To understand the Ford Model T is to understand how technology, labor, and culture collided in one pivotal moment, birthing not just a product but a movement that would roll across the globe. As we dive into this story, we'll see how one simple, boxy machine earned the title, "The Car That Put the World on Wheels," and how its legacy is still shaping the roads we drive today. If you're enjoying this journey already, hit like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which vehicle you'd like to see explored next. The Ford Model T of 1908 is where the modern American story of mobility truly begins. Its boxy silhouette might look quaint today, but at the time, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Before its arrival, automobiles were fragile novelties for the wealthy, hand-built at great cost and maintained with difficulty. The Model T shifted that dynamic by being intentionally designed to be robust, simple, and above all, affordable. Its frame could handle the rutted dirt roads of rural America. Its engine was easy enough for a farmer to repair with basic tools, and its price fell year by year until it became within reach for ordinary families. The moment you compare what came before and what the Model T offered, you realize it wasn't just a car. It was the first machine that felt like a social equalizer on wheels. This sets the stage for how Ford's bold gamble changed not only the auto industry, but the very rhythms of American life. Microstory. Imagine a young family in the 1910s living in a small Midwestern town. Before the Model T, their world was bounded by the distance a horse could travel and the schedule of trains they couldn't always afford. When the father brings home a Model T, suddenly church, markets, and relatives in nearby towns are within easy reach, and Sunday drives become a new ritual. For the first time, mobility is voluntary rather than dictated by necessity, creating a new cultural fabric around leisure and choice. It's not just transportation, it's liberation measured in miles. Microstory. In another corner of America, a farmer who once struggled to get produce to market in time now loads it into a Model T, cutting travel from half a day by horse to just a couple of hours. His livelihood changes overnight. He can sell fresher goods, reach more buyers, and compete beyond his immediate region. The vehicle becomes an extension of his work, blurring the line between personal freedom and economic survival. Multiply that by thousands of farmers, and the impact on rural economies becomes unmistakable. Context digest. The affordability of the Ford Model T didn't arrive all at once. In its first year, it cost around $850, a hefty sum in 1908 dollars. But Ford's relentless push toward efficiency meant that by the mid-1910s, the price dropped below $400, and eventually closer to $300. This radical downward curve in pricing wasn't just good marketing. It redefined the economics of manufacturing, forcing other industries to rethink scale, production, and accessibility. The car became the first widely recognized symbol that technology could be democratized. Microstory. The ease of use was another factor that made the Model T a cultural phenomenon. While earlier cars often required technical knowledge to operate, including hand-cranking engines and complex gear changes, the Model T was designed with simplicity in mind. It still demanded effort. You had to crank start it unless you bought a later version with an electric starter, but compared to its competitors, it was approachable. For many Americans, this was their first sustained contact with a machine that felt like it worked for them rather than demanded expertise. That psychological shift cannot be overstated. Reflection bridge. At its core, the Model T didn't just open doors to new places. It lowered the barrier between ordinary people and modern technology. Context Digest. The durability of the car was part of its myth. Advertisements and anecdotes alike told of Model Ts being driven through mud, hauled over fields, or even converted into makeshift tractors. This wasn't embellishment. Its high ground clearance and strong chassis meant it could handle terrain that rival vehicles would never attempt. It became a machine that rural America could trust, one that could take a beating and still come back for more. This dependability earned it a reputation not just as transportation, but as a partner in daily survival. Microstory. Take the story of early traveling salesmen who found that the Model T allowed them to reach customers in towns previously cut off by geography. One man with a trunk full of goods could now crisscross multiple counties in a single week, expanding his business in ways that rail schedules never allowed. The vehicle reshaped commerce at the most granular level, stitching together economies of scale one road at a time. Stories like these explain why the Model T became more than just a purchase. It was an engine of ambition. Context Digest. While the Model T was gaining ground, its popularity coincided with the dawn of paved roads in America. Communities realized that if people were going to buy cars, they needed infrastructure to support them. Town councils lobbied for smoother surfaces, states invested in highways, and the federal government began to see road building as a national priority. In a sense, the Model T didn't just use roads. It created the demand that built them. This chicken and egg dynamic shows how one product can bend public policy around itself. Reflection bridge. By democratizing mobility, the Model T pulled entire communities into the orbit of progress, setting off ripples that would shape the 20th century. And if affordability, durability, and accessibility were its first acts, what came next was an even bigger disruption: the way Ford changed the very mechanics of making things. This is where the story turns from product to process, leading us straight into the rise of the moving assembly line. The Ford Model T of 1908 may have won hearts on the road, but its deeper legacy lies in the way it was built. The moving assembly line became as famous as the car itself. Henry Ford realized that making a car affordable meant not just designing it simply, but producing it in a way that multiplied efficiency beyond anything the industry had seen. By 1913, his Highland Park plant in Michigan unveiled a system where workers stayed put while the car moved to them, cutting assembly time from more than 12 hours to just 90 minutes. This seismic shift didn't just lower costs. It redefined modern manufacturing, creating both admiration and unease about what it meant to be a worker in an industrial age. The Model T became inseparable from the story of mass production. Microstory. Picture a worker in 1912 building cars by hand. He walks back and forth across a workshop, lifting parts, assembling components, and repeating this laborious process. A year later, that same worker stands at a single station, repeating one task endlessly as the car glides past on a conveyor. His productivity skyrockets, but his sense of craftsmanship disappears. The transformation feels both empowering and alienating, a perfect reflection of the tension at the heart of Ford's empire. Context Digest. The assembly line wasn't invented from scratch. It borrowed principles from industries like meatpacking, where carcasses moved down rails while butchers worked in sequence. Ford's genius was in reversing that flow and applying it to complex machinery. By standardizing parts and breaking labor into repetitive tasks, he created a rhythm that machines and people could follow. The result was consistency, speed, and volume on a scale that no rival could match. Yet this same brilliance drew criticism, sparking debates that stretched far beyond the factory walls. Microstory. For many workers, the conditions were brutal. 12-hour days of monotonous labor left bodies sore and spirits drained, and turnover soared as men quit within weeks of being hired. In response, Ford introduced the famous $5 day in 1914, doubling the average wage and drawing headlines worldwide. Suddenly, jobs at Ford's plant became coveted despite the tedium, and the company gained an edge not only in efficiency, but also in loyalty. The Model T wasn't just a product of mass production, it was the catalyst for new labor economics. Context Digest. The $5 day had ripple effects across America. Other manufacturers bristled at Ford's move, calling it reckless, yet they couldn't ignore the pressure it placed on wages elsewhere. At the same time, workers could now afford the very cars they built, completing a self-reinforcing cycle of production and consumption. The Model T's rise wasn't simply about a cheap car. It was about a system where labor and product fed into each other in a closed loop of demand. That cycle reshaped the American middle class. Reflection bridge. The Model T didn't just put wheels under families. It tied wages, work, and consumer identity together in a way that defined the American dream. Micro story. Beyond labor, the assembly line touched global ambitions. Ford exported the method abroad, and soon factories in Europe, South America, and even Asia adopted versions of the system. This wasn't just about cars anymore, it was about setting a standard for industrialization worldwide. A Model T rolling out of a factory in England or Argentina carried not just American engineering, but American methods of making and organizing work. The car became a cultural ambassador for efficiency, whether admired or resented. Context digest. Critics argued that while efficiency created prosperity, it also reduced people to cogs in a machine. Writers and social commentators lamented the loss of individuality and craftsmanship, warning that such systems would breed alienation. At the same time, boosters praised the democratizing power of affordable goods, seeing the assembly line as a force for equality. This divide wasn't just academic. It captured a broader cultural struggle over what modern life should look like. The Model T stood at the center of that argument. Micro story. Think of a rural teenager who gets his first job at a Ford plant. He trades farm chores for factory shifts, earning steady cash for the first time. That income buys clothes, supports his family, and maybe even pays for a Model T of his own. Yet his work is narrow, repetitive, and uncreative, a far cry from the varied problem-solving of farm life. The shift reflects a bigger societal trade-off: stability and wages in exchange for monotony and mechanization. Reflection bridge. The Model T showed that efficiency could create abundance, but it also forced America to confront the costs of industrial progress. Context digest. By the late 1910s and early 1920s, Ford was producing cars at a pace the world had never seen. Millions rolled out, saturating cities and countryside alike. The sheer scale created problems of its own, from traffic jams in downtown areas to rising demand for oil and rubber. The Model T wasn't just a product anymore. It was an ecosystem, pulling in raw materials, workers, and infrastructure at a staggering rate. That web of connections became the blueprint for modern consumer industries. Microstory. At the heart of it all was the ordinary American driver, who suddenly found himself part of a national experiment in mobility. Families piled into Model Ts for vacations. Businesses relied on them for deliveries, and farmers turned them into makeshift tractors. Every new use expanded the car's influence, reinforcing its central role in daily life. By the early 1920s, the Model T was no longer just a product. It was a cultural phenomenon that defined what it meant to live in modern America. And as its dominance grew, so did questions about its long-term impact on society, setting us up for the next stage of the story: how the Model T reshaped not just factories and families, but the very landscape of the United States. The Triumph Trident 750 entered its later years with a reputation both formidable and fragile, and by then its fate was sealed. What began as Britain's bold attempt to stave off a rising tide had become a case study in how even strong engineering can be undone by timing and circumstance. The Trident was fast, thrilling, and distinct, but the world was no longer waiting for British bikes to catch up. Each year that passed brought newer, smoother, more advanced machines from competitors, and the gap widened until the Trident could only occupy a niche. To understand its place now, we have to see it not as a failed motorcycle, but as a symbol of transition. Microstory. Imagine a garage in the late 1970s. A rider polishing a Triumph Trident 750 that had already been eclipsed on the market. Friends might laugh that it leaked oil, or that parts were a nightmare to source, but the owner didn't care. To them, the Triple was a living memory of racing glory and roaring open roads, a machine that spoke of individuality. Owning one meant resisting the tide of sameness, and that resistance gave the Trident a second life as an enthusiast's machine rather than a mainstream product. Context digest. By the time the Trident faded from production, the British motorcycle industry had contracted sharply. Factory struggles, labor disputes, and declining exports compounded the technical disadvantages. Yet even in that decline, the Trident stood as evidence that Britain hadn't lost its creativity or spirit. The triple configuration would inspire future revivals decades later, proving that the concept had merit even if the execution was outpaced by rivals at the time. The Trident's DNA lingered, waiting to be rediscovered in new eras. Reflection bridge. Legacy often outlives market success, and the Trident's influence can be seen most clearly in hindsight. Micro story. In the vintage motorcycle community today, the Triumph Trident 750 is prized not just for its rarity, but for its character. Collectors admire the challenge of restoring and maintaining it, seeing each bike as a puzzle that demands both mechanical skill and emotional investment. At rallies and shows, the sight of a well-preserved Trident draws knowing nods because it represents more than a machine. It represents defiance. This afterlife has secured the Trident a cult following far stronger than its original sales ever suggested, ensuring its story continues in conversations and collections worldwide. Context digest. Looking back, the Trident shows us how market forces can reshape entire industries. It reminds us that raw performance and racing victories are not enough when consumers demand accessibility and convenience. The Trident's fall was not about a lack of power, but about a mismatch between what it offered and what the mass market wanted. That gap defined the 1970s and reshaped motorcycling permanently. Yet the Triple's very existence ensured that British bikes did not fade quietly. They went down swinging, with a roar that still echoes today. Micro story. The last twist in the Triumph Trident 750's tale comes from how it's remembered by those who never even rode one. For many enthusiasts, it represents the what-if of British motorcycling, a glimpse of what could have been if resources had matched ambition. The fact that people still ask those questions decades later is a testament to how powerful the bike's myth has become. It was not the machine that saved Britain's industry, but it was the one that made sure its spirit would not be forgotten. Reflection bridge. And so the Trident stands, not as a champion of sales charts, but as a champion of resilience, remembered for the fight it gave rather than the battle it lost. Context digest. In America especially, the Trident story resonates as a classic underdog narrative. It was the scrappy fighter against overwhelming odds, the bike that kept showing up even when the odds were impossible. That's why it holds a place in US motorcycle culture today, not as a common sight on highways, but as a treasured artifact of a turning point in history. This realization brings us to the heart of the matter, where the Trident's legacy becomes less about defeat and more about what it left behind for future generations of riders and builders. The Ford Model T of 1908 stands today not only as an engineering milestone, but as a cultural anchor that shifted America into the modern age. Its story is about more than gears, steel, or production lines. It's about how one machine altered the balance of work, leisure, geography, and identity in a country that was still finding its stride in the 20th century. By making mobility affordable, the Model T cracked open opportunities that had been locked to the wealthy, allowing working families to define their own horizons. In doing so, it set the template for the American dream: mobility as freedom, prosperity tied to access, and identity shaped by what you drove. Over our journey, we've seen how the Model T rewrote the rules of manufacturing, slashing costs and introducing a rhythm of labor that still underpins global industries today. We've explored how it transformed daily life, from farmers who doubled their markets to suburban families who reshaped the map of America, and how it created ripple effects in oil, road building, service culture, and even government regulation. We've also examined its paradoxes: a liberating tool born from monotonous labor, a simple machine that spawned sprawling complexity, a democratizing force that locked America into decades of car dependence. These contrasts make the Model T more than a relic. They make it a mirror for how society balances progress and cost. For anyone in the United States looking at the legacy of the Model T, the lessons remain vivid. Ownership meant more than just having a vehicle. It meant participating in a national shift toward mobility as an expectation, not a luxury. Markets today, from electric cars to ride-sharing apps, are still chasing that same balance between accessibility, efficiency, and freedom that Ford stumbled upon more than a century ago. Every new mobility revolution is, in some way, a descendant of the Model T's original promise: to put ordinary people in control of extraordinary possibilities. The Ford Model T may no longer roam the roads in numbers, but its DNA is everywhere, in the structure of cities, in the culture of travel, and in the rhythm of production that still powers industries. Its boxy body and rattling engine may seem distant, yet it remains one of the few machines that truly altered the course of human history. When you strip away the nostalgia and look at the legacy, the verdict is clear. The car that put the world on wheels never really stopped moving, It simply became the foundation of the journey we're still on today.